This is Brandon Zukas, and this is my Hacksaw Ridge video analysis. Just a heads up, I do have some people over because it is Halloween. It's Aiden and Connor, so if you hear them, I apologize. 1.1 for the film's theme. It is courageous to stick to one's beliefs. I had a really hard time trying to identify the theme for this film. I felt like there were a few other themes that could have worked for this, and it was a hard time to try to word this. And it's mostly because of there's definitely a religious point to this, him being religious, but I feel like there's a little bit more going on, mostly with the dialogue and the conflict. There is a hatred towards Das because he can't use, he refuses to use a weapon. But in the dialogue, I think they really hammer in kind of why they thought he was that way. Like, they viewed him as less courageous, not brave, like a coward. They viewed him in a bad light because he didn't want to use a weapon. They didn't view his religion. They did seem it weird, but they weren't shutting him from religion. They were shutting him for not wanting to touch a weapon while being in war. And I think the way that it uses real interviews at the end, which I'll talk about in a bit, really aids to that. They said early on during the shooting range scene, when the captain will go without him, I feel like that's a real big arc there, because they show that he is brave because he stuck to his beliefs there, with the dialogue. I just thought the use of music was really interesting. When he was being a medic and going around and helping people, they usually, if I remember correctly, were using the same kind of music that they used during the battle sequences as well. And then also with casting, I felt that it was purposeful that they made him talk the way he did, and the way that he was skinny and scrawny was just to add to that character that he was just maybe could amount for nothing. And this is just kind of a deeper dive, kind of pictures into those certain scenes, like when the commander kind of gives him the thanks, and the different battle scenes, how they use kind of the same music, and also the same tone. It's very interesting looking at the different tones between different colors. I am colorblind, but I can see a difference between the certain battle scenes and when they're not in battle, and I think that might also be a little selective. Now 1.3 for plot elements. This is kind of what I was saying with how at the end, I think it was very purposeful having those real life testimonies of the people who knew Das. And the captain or the sergeant does say that he's the most courageous man he's ever seen, or something along those lines. And I think that is what we're supposed to take away from it. That yes, his religion was a big play in it, but it was the fact that he was still courageous, even though he didn't want to hold a weapon. I also thought that having the main event of Das's story being the climax really helps us see him as a person. I feel like it was a little long and we got a lot of his life, but I feel like that was also on purpose. We, as an audience, really got to be with him and understand why he is the way he is. There is more to his story other than just religion, especially with his brother and the brick, his dad and the gun, and I feel like it's very purposeful that we don't see that full story of his dad and the weapon until later on in the movie when he's opening up to somebody else who has the opposite views of him. And then for theological category, I had a really hard time identifying this one as well, but I went with harmatology, the study of sin. Moving on to 2.1, the biblical narrative analysis, the story of Cain and Abel highlights the category of harmatology, as Cain commits one of the early sins of murder. It was really difficult to try to find a biblical story that had to deal with sin, even though there are many out there. I didn't want to go with Adam and Eve, because I just felt like that was a little too kind of cliche, and I think this one's cliche too, but I will have a purpose later on. But moving on, now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries for me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You'll be a restless wanderer on the earth." Pick this story for the study of sin because it's one of the earlier recorded sins in the story of Genesis. It is the first murder. It is the first sin committed of murder. And I feel that it is a good look on it because, what led to this murder was jealousy. And later in the Bible, it does tell us how I feel like being jealous is kind of it's been a while since I've studied the Bible, but jealousy I remember as being a big part of it. So I feel like this alone, though, just showing how jealousy led to murder so quickly, is just shining a bad light on it, of course. But it's also showing how you have to rule over sin. That sin, that you can be more powerful in sin, you have to, admit for it. But Cain doesn't do that. Cain just falls into jealousy, into sin, and commits the first murder. And he has to live with this decision for the rest of his life. Now, reading the story again, I didn't remember that. Well, I didn't know that he has a long line of family later on. And which leads in just to the next son of Adam and Eve. But it is just very interesting seeing the results of Cain's sin to all of humanity and to Cain and his family himself. It really, I feel like it's a very generic story when it comes to the story of sin, as it's a very, in my opinion, black and white sin rather than some others that have a little bit more depth to them. Moving on to 3.1, we have the integrative analysis. Restating 1.1, it is courageous to stick to one's beliefs. And 2.1, the story of Cain and Abel, highlights the category of hamartology, as Cain commits one of the early sins of murder, and Cain now must live with his decision. Now, I know it's really easy to say that I picked this story because of, the entire time he's fighting, Doss is fighting over the sin of murder. But there is more to that. I felt like Cain made a decision to go through with the murder, and he made a decision to lie to God. And I felt that in the movie, there was also a sense of making a decision to stick to things. And now, yes, they are kind of different. I think Hacksaw Ridge has a separate view on sin, how it's redeemable. I feel like in the story of Cain, it's not as redeemable in the moment because Cain doesn't redeem himself. He kind of just has to live with that for the rest of his life. While in Hacksaw Ridge, in the earlier earlier plot points in the movie, he's making mistakes. His family's making mistakes, but they get over this towards the end. But I also feel that the belief not to kill is also in the sense of not to sin, because Doss is kind of, he's living very, on the dot with the religion, and I feel like the not to kill can also apply not to sin. And yes, you might be saying the implied author, is that really what they're saying? I would argue it is, that it's not just on blanket surface the thing to kill, which it very much could be. I feel like it is more of the sin in general. I also thought that Hacksaw Ridge really dove into separating from one's beliefs. His family was a lot different than he was, and everyone around him was a lot different. And he had to separate and come up with his own decisions and own beliefs. And that's kind of something with hamartology as well, that just I thought was very interesting. I thought that the two, again, on a surface level relate, but the story of Cain and Abel is also very interesting, of just how shortened it is and how it's just he never redeems himself. But Hacksaw Ridge, I believe he does not sin, but he does redeem himself in not doing that, in my mind.